You wouldn't believe what people will do for a dare. Alexander Pierce, a wealthy bachelor known for his flashy cars and private jets, thought he was unstoppable. One night, fueled by arrogance and challenged by his closest friends, he sealed a bet that would change his life forever, to marry a humble waitress he met on a whim. Little did he know, beneath her modest exterior lay a secret so earth-shattering that it would upend his carefully curated world. As champagne fizzed, paparazzi flashed, and vows were exchanged, a single revelation on their wedding night left Alexander utterly speechless and changed both their destinies forever. Alexander Pierce was a man who thrived on danger and lived for the spotlight. At 29, he had already amassed a multi-million-dollar fortune through a combination of old family money and his own cunning investments in tech startups. He had a broad social circle. His nights were spent in exclusive bars with people like James Morrison, a close friend who ran a hedge fund, and Lucy Henderson, a social media influencer with millions of followers. Alexander's phone brimmed with invitations to yacht parties on the Amalfi Coast, philanthropic galas in Paris, and private poker nights with the country's elite. One balmy summer evening in New York City, Alexander hosted a lavish dinner at a rooftop restaurant in Manhattan. Among the guests were his longtime confidants, James, Lucy, and a flamboyant venture capitalist named Carter Delman. The night was glimmering with city lights that sparkled below, and waiters glided about with silver trays offering caviar and champagne. Soft jazz played in the background, blending with the hum of city life and the occasional swirl of helicopter blades overhead. As the evening progressed, the talk turned from stocks and philanthropic causes to the subject of true love, if it existed or if wealth overshadowed all. Lucy, reading the conversation's temperature, teased Alexander by pointing out his history of short-lived flings and lack of serious commitment. James, riding the wave of friendly banter, goaded Alexander. "You say you can get anyone you want," he said. "But would you marry someone who doesn't even move in your circles? I mean, truly out of your league, say, a normal waitress? You wouldn't last a day," Alexander scoffed. "You think I can't? I could marry a total stranger tomorrow if I wished and stay married for a year without a hiccup." Carter, ever the instigator, raised his glass. "That's a bold claim. Prove it." Maybe it was the champagne, maybe it was the desire to quash the insinuation that he feared real love or real people. Maybe it was just Alexander's competitive streak. Whatever it was, the words tumbled out of his mouth before he could think them through. "I will marry someone ordinary like a waitress, and I guarantee I'll make it look like the grandest love story of the decade." James's eyebrows shot up, Lucy gasped, and Carter smirked. "Let's make it interesting," Carter said. "I bet you $2 million you won't go through with a wedding under those terms." The restaurant's music softened, as though eavesdropping. Every member at the table turned to see if Alexander would take the bait. There was a pulsing hush, a tension that dared him to say yes. Alexander put down his flute of champagne. "2 million? Done. But I choose the woman." Of course they all laughed, clapped, or teased him. They were intoxicated not just by the alcohol, but by the sheer audacity of the bet. The shadows of the city seemed to dance with excitement, mirroring the thrill in their eyes. By the end of the night, the stage was set. Alexander, coddled in wealth and convinced of his own charm, had made a promise. A bizarre promise to marry a random waitress. He half smirked to himself, believing wholeheartedly that it would be just another game in his glamorous life. No one suspected that this challenge would evolve into the biggest gamble he had ever taken, one that would threaten not only his pride but his entire perception of love, family, and fate. A week later, Alexander and Lucy met at a bustling cafe known for its artisanal pastries and college town vibe. It was not his usual scene, with its kitschy chalkboard menus and rickety wooden chairs. But Lucy, in an attempt to find someone completely ordinary, had insisted they move out of his comfort zone. They sat at a corner table near a floor-to-ceiling window. Lucy tapped her manicured nails on the tabletop. "You realize this entire thing is insane, right?" she said, her voice low but urgent. "What if you actually fall in love or something?" Alexander chuckled. "Lucy, please, this is business. If by some miracle I find genuine affection, I'm sure I can handle it." He scanned the room, families huddled together over plates of croissants. Students hammered away on laptops. A pair of grandparents chuckled over a shared dessert. Then his eyes landed on a waitress weaving her way through the crowd, with a tray of coffee mugs balanced expertly on one hand. She was petite, with soft brown hair pinned back in a simple bun. Her uniform was worn, the edges frayed, but her face wore an earnest smile. She approached a nearby table, gracefully sliding the mugs into place. He could see she carried herself with quiet confidence, though her cheeks were flushed with the effort of her busy shift. He glanced at Lucy. "What about her?" Lucy followed his gaze and shrugged. "She looks nice enough, but are you really going to do this right here, right now?" He smirked. "Watch me." The waitress walked back to the counter, collecting another tray. Alexander slipped out of his seat and followed her. Up close, he noticed she had flecks of gold in her hazel eyes and subtle laughter lines that hinted at a sense of humor. She barely looked at him as she turned to fill another customer's order. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, could I, place an order with you?" She offered a polite smile but seemed a bit harried. "Of course, sir. What can I get you?" "An espresso. And maybe your name?" She paused, wary. "My name?" He nodded. "Yes, please. I'm Alexander." She slowly extended her hand, as though half expecting him to simply vanish. "Cassidy Dawson," she said, then resumed filling up a glass for another table. "Cassidy Dawson," he repeated, letting the name roll off his tongue. "That's lovely." She tried not to look too amused, but he could see a faint curve on her lips. "Thank you. Your espresso will be right up. I'd also like to speak with you personally," Alexander pressed gently, lowering his voice. "If you have a break." She eyed him, curiosity evident. "I get off at 4, but I have errands. Is this about something important?" Alexander flashed a charming smile. "Possibly a job offer." Her eyebrows rose. "A job offer?" He shrugged. "I have some openings in my organization. Looking for a personal assistant, maybe. Good pay." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, I'll talk to you when I'm off." He returned to Lucy's side, heart oddly racing. He reminded himself this was a bet, a challenge. Yet the sensation, the slight flutter in his chest, unnerved him. She was just a waitress after all. Yet something about her voice and that resilient spark in her eyes intrigued him in a way he hadn't anticipated. At exactly 4, Cassidy packed up her belongings and walked over to Alexander's table. Lucy had already left, granting him space. The cafe was quieter now, most of the lunch crowd gone. They stood by the window, the city hum, a soothing background score. "So," Cassidy said, crossing her arms. "What's this about?" He took a breath. "I told you I'm looking for a personal assistant, but the truth is, it's more complicated." Her eyes narrowed. "Spill it." "I'm a busy person. I don't like games." He almost laughed. She was busy. Yet, he was the one with multiple companies and business deals to juggle. But the honesty in her tone disarmed him. So he explained the basics, that he was interested in her intelligence, her poise, and that he had opportunities that might make her life easier. Cassidy listened, but she didn't look impressed. "And you want me to just drop everything and go work for you? I want to get to know you first. Let me take you to dinner," he said, confidence shining through. "And we'll see where this goes." She raised an eyebrow, a flicker of mischief in her expression. "I hope you know I'm not that easy. But dinner sounds okay. One condition, though. Name it. No fancy 5-star place. Just normal dinner. I don't want to feel out of place." He was taken aback. Most people he knew flocked to the finest restaurants in the city, but he found himself intrigued. "Deal. Pick the spot. I'll meet you there." She smiled. "I know just the place." And with that, she walked away, leaving him feeling as though, for the first time in years, he might be in over his head. Alexander found himself standing outside a small Italian diner in Queens a few nights later. Old neon lights flickered overhead, illuminating the cracked sidewalk. People streamed in and out, mostly locals greeting each other with friendly nods. The warm smell of tomatoes, fresh basil, and melting mozzarella drifted onto the street. He glanced around, half expecting he might be recognized, but no one gave him a second look. It was oddly refreshing yet unsettling. He wasn't used to being just another face in a crowd. Suddenly, Cassidy appeared around the corner, clad in a simple yellow sundress. Her hair was down, and a small silver bracelet dangled from her wrist. She looked effortlessly charming, like a ray of sunshine in the dimly lit street. "Hey," she said, giving him a shy smile. "Hi," he breathed, momentarily lost for words. This was part of the plan, he reminded himself. Charm her, woo her, win the bet. Shall we go inside? Inside the diner, vinyl booths and checkered floors awaited them. A jukebox in the corner played tunes from the 80s. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of families celebrating anniversaries and birthdays. A cheerful hostess named Maria greeted Cassidy by name. "Ciao, Bella. You finally brought a friend, eh?" Cassidy laughed. "Just a friend, Maria. Can we get a booth?" They settled into a corner booth. The air smelled of fresh baked bread, and a jovial waiter placed menus in front of them. Alexander felt a million miles away from his usual haunts of crystal chandeliers and impeccable white tablecloths. He noted how Cassidy greeted the staff like old pals, even inquiring about Maria's mother's health. She caught him staring and blushed slightly. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing. You look comfortable here. It's nice." She smiled. "I've been coming here since I was a kid. My family didn't have much, but we always treated ourselves to pizza once a month." Something in her tone softened him. This was her world, cozy, genuine, and marked by the warmth of community. He realized how foreign it felt to him. They ordered pasta dishes and chatted about small things, the best pizza toppings, the funniest coffee shop mishaps she'd witnessed while working. Eventually, he steered the conversation to her life. She hesitated. "Well, it's been tough. My mum, she passed a few years back. My dad left when I was a baby. I've been on my own for a while, juggling shifts, but I manage." His chest tightened. "I'm sorry about your mum. That must have been hard." "Yeah," she said quietly. "It was. She was my rock, and when she got sick, medical bills piled up. I dropped out of college to support her. But she always believed in me, even on her worst days." A pang of guilt nudged him. He was here to marry her on a bet, yet she was opening up about real hardships. He cleared his throat. "I'm sure she'd be proud of you," he said softly. "You're resilient." She gave him a measured look. "I have to be. Nobody's going to do it for me." As the evening progressed, he found himself truly laughing, genuinely enjoying her company. It wasn't forced or contrived, and for once, he wasn't performing as Alexander the millionaire. He was just Alexander, a guy on a date in a small diner, listening to an earnest woman talk about her world. When the check arrived, Cassidy insisted on splitting it. He raised an eyebrow. "But I invited you," she shrugged. "I don't like feeling like I owe anyone anything. Let me pay my share." A swirl of admiration and confusion coursed through him as he handed the waiter his credit card, letting Cassidy slip a few bills in, too. This was so unlike the socialites he dated before, who expected lavish gifts and demanded the best of everything. Walking her home, they passed by rows of modest houses. Children played on steps, their laughter echoing in the summer air. The conversation turned quiet. When they reached her block, she turned to him. "Thank you for dinner. It was nice. Different, but nice." He smiled. "I had a really good time. Can I see you again?" She paused, biting her lip. "Sure. But just so you know, I'm not in it for a fling. My life's complicated enough. If you're not serious, tell me now." He swallowed. "I'm serious," he said, surprising even himself with how much he meant it in that moment. She nodded, then stood on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. "Good night, Alexander." He watched her walk away, her silhouette disappearing into the porch light. He stood there for a moment longer, wrestling with a tangle of emotions, curiosity, respect, guilt, and something unsettlingly close to admiration. This was supposed to be a straightforward bet charm the waitress, marry her and collect $2 million. But he felt it in the pit of his stomach. Nothing about Cassidy Dawson would be simple. Alexander woke the next morning to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly. Groggy and half-dressed, he glanced at the screen. It was his mother, Estelle Pierce. She rarely called this early, which meant something important was up. With a sigh, he answered. "Alexander," she said in that crisp tone that always made him feel like a misbehaving teenager again. "I heard a rumor that you're seeing someone." He frowned. News traveled fast among the elite, apparently. Maybe Lucy had blabbed, or Carter had dropped a hint somewhere. "Yes, Mother. Is that a crime?" "You know your father and I have been concerned about your relationships. You pick these trivial entanglements. If you're serious about marrying someone, at least ensure it's someone of our stature." "I heard she's a waitress, Alexander. A waitress." He felt a flicker of annoyance. "I am well aware of her occupation." Estelle sighed dramatically on the other end. "We're hosting a family dinner next week with the Rothschilds. Do bring her. If you're determined to continue this farce, I would like to meet her." He rubbed his temple. This wasn't good. A family dinner? Where the likes of the Rothschilds, old money families, might stare at Cassidy like she was from another planet? But he could hardly refuse now. The bet demanded he push forward. "Fine, Mother. I'll let her know." An uneasy dread settled over him as the conversation ended. He could already picture Cassidy seated at their grand dining room table, subjected to snarky comments or condescending questions about her background. Yet, he found himself oddly protective of her. The thought of her being judged by his parents ignited a spark of rebellion. Later that day, he met James for lunch at an upscale steakhouse in Midtown. James wasted no time. "So, how's Operation Waitress?" he teased, swirling a glass of scotch. "You do realize Carter's deadline is in 6 months. You have to actually marry her by then." Alexander leaned back in the plush leather seat. "I know," he said flatly. "Things are progressing." James looked at him skeptically. "You sound different, man. Don't tell me you're actually liking this girl." He hesitated, a faint flush creeping up his neck. "She's nice, James. She's not like the others." James shook his head in disbelief. "You remember the bet, right? $2 million if you marry her and stay with her for a year. If you're catching feelings, that complicates everything." Alexander forced a grin. "Relax. I'm not going soft. Everything is under control." But was it? He couldn't ignore the growing pit in his stomach. After lunch, he texted Cassidy to see if she was free that evening. She replied almost instantly, "Yes." Looking forward to it. They met in Central Park, strolling among the twilight haze, the lampposts turning on one by one like a gentle wave. Street performers played violin under stone archways. Cassidy clutched a small coffee, gazing in awe at the canopy of trees overhead. "It's so beautiful here," she mused. "I forget, living in the city, how peaceful nature can feel." He smiled at how easily she found wonder in simple things. "I need to ask you something," he said, the weight of his mother's invitation heavy on his mind. Cassidy turned to him, her eyes bright. "Go ahead. Well, my mother wants to meet you. There's a family dinner next week. She froze. Your mother wants to meet me? Already? He nodded. She heard about you and insisted. Cassidy's face hardened a bit, as though bracing for impact. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Alexander. Wealthy families don't exactly welcome people like me with open arms. He gently took her hand. I won't let them disrespect you. She studied his expression. All right. If it's important to you, I'll do it. His chest eased. Thank you. We'll go together. They continued their walk, and he found himself relaxed in her presence, the city's chaos melting away. She told him stories about her childhood, about how she once saved up spare change to buy her mother a tiny gold pendant for Christmas. He laughed, telling her how he once crashed his father's Bentley during a rebellious phase. There was a surprising symmetry in their confessions, hers about scarcity, his about excess. The more they talked, the more Alexander realized she was unafraid to call him out on his entitlement. She challenged him to see the world differently through her eyes, full of earnest struggle and unwavering optimism. It felt refreshing, like a crisp breeze in a stagnant room. By the end of the evening, they stood at the park's exit, an awkward heaviness lingering as though neither wanted to leave. Finally, she leaned in and kissed him softly. The lights of the city glittered in the distance. He placed a hand on her waist, drawing her closer, the moment unexpected yet perfect. When they parted, she gave a small laugh. Who knew we'd be here just a few weeks after meeting? He smirked, though his heart thudded. Life is full of surprises. And as she walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that for all the money in the world, there was no price on the warmth spreading through his chest. No bet that could replicate the genuine connection forming between them. Estelle Pierce's mansion was a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Manhattan, an old-world architectural masterpiece that boasted marble columns, manicured gardens, and a driveway lined with imported trees. On the night of the family dinner, Alexander arrived with Cassidy in a sleek black limousine, an extravagance that made her frown. You really didn't have to send a limo, she murmured. A simple cab ride would have been fine. He gave her an apologetic smile. My mother has appearances to keep. Trust me, she'd notice if we pulled up in anything less. They stepped out onto the grand driveway, the massive double doors opened by uniformed staff. Chandeliers glimmered in the foyer, reflecting off the polished marble floors. Cassidy stiffened beside him, clearly overwhelmed by the display of wealth. A butler led them into the dining hall, where a long mahogany table was set with gleaming crystal and gold-plated cutlery. Estelle Pierce, an elegant woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes, sat at the head, chatting quietly with a similarly refined couple. Alexander's father, William Pierce, a stern figure with a slightly stooped posture, occupied the seat next to her. Upon seeing Alexander and Cassidy, Estelle rose, her lips pressed into a polite but thin smile. Alexander, darling, there you are. Her gaze slid over Cassidy. And you must be Cassidy. Welcome. Cassidy offered a nervous smile. Thank you for having me. Estelle's eyes flitted over Cassidy's modest black dress, her minimal jewelry. It's lovely to meet you. We've heard so much. Alexander cleared his throat. Mother, father, this is my girlfriend. He hesitated on the word, but realized it was accurate. Cassidy Dawson. His father grunted an acknowledgement, shaking her hand briskly, then introduced the couple beside him, Lawrence and Eugenia Rothschild, old friends of the family. Dinner began politely enough. Bowls of creamy soup, followed by a delicate fish course, then roasted lamb. The hush of the air was punctuated by the clink of silverware. Inevitably, the conversation turned to backgrounds. The Rothschilds boasted about their philanthropic endeavors. Estelle nodded with interest. Then Estelle fixed Cassidy with a curious look. So, my dear, Alexander says you're in the hospitality industry. Cassidy swallowed, but held her composure. I work at a cafe. I'm a waitress. Estelle's lips parted in a feigned expression of pleasant surprise. How humble. Cassidy's shoulders tensed. I enjoy it. I meet all sorts of people and learn a great deal from them. Alexander squeezed Cassidy's hand under the table, silently offering support. The conversation meandered to Alexander's business ventures, from which the families derived a sense of pride. Cassidy mostly listened, adding a comment here or there. Suddenly, Eugenia Rothschild asked, "Do you plan to continue working as a waitress if you and Alexander get more serious?" Cassidy hesitated. She glanced at Alexander, then said calmly, "Yes. I have bills to pay, and I'm proud of what I do." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence, followed by forced smiles. Estelle tried to cover her tension with a swirl of her wine. "That's quite admirable, dear." As soon as dinner ended, Estelle suggested they move to the drawing room. Alexander led Cassidy through the corridor, feeling her slight tremble. He whispered, "You okay?" She nodded. "Just this is a lot. I feel like I'm being interviewed for a role I didn't apply for." He frowned. "I'm sorry. My family can be intense, but I promise you I've got your back." Before they could say more, Estelle swept in, guiding them to a secluded corner. "Cassidy, darling, might I have a word?" Cassidy nodded hesitantly, shooting Alexander a glance. He nodded back, uncertain but willing to grant them space. Estelle led Cassidy to a small seating area beneath a portrait of Alexander's grandmother. Estelle's voice was hushed. "Let's skip the pleasantries. I see Alexander is taken with you, and you seem lovely. But a woman in your position must understand what it means to be part of the Pierce family." Cassidy met her gaze. "I'm not entirely sure I do." Estelle exhaled. "There are obligations, social appearances, philanthropic duties. We can't afford scandal or impropriety. My son is not just a man, he's an heir and a public figure. Now, I'm not accusing you of anything, dear, but I've seen many women try to snare men of Alexander's status for financial security. I'd hate for that to be the case here." Cassidy's cheeks burned, but she kept her composure. "I'm not trying to snare anyone. I care about Alexander as a person, not as a bank account." Estelle tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I do hope so. For your sake, I'll only warn you once. If you mean my son harm, or if you're after his fortune, you'll regret it." A swirl of anger, hurt, and determination surged in Cassidy's chest. She stood. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Pierce, but I'm not after his fortune, and I'm not scared of you." The older woman's eyes widened, surprised by such directness. Before she could retort, Cassidy turned and left the drawing room. She found Alexander waiting outside, concern etched on his face. "What happened?" he asked softly. Cassidy forced a smile. "Nothing. Your mother just wants the best for you." He frowned, sensing more, but she shook her head, slipping her hand through his arm. "I think I'd like to go home," he nodded, guiding her to the exit. Tension crackled in the air, overshadowing the opulent surroundings. As they drove away, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing in quicksand, caught between loyalty to his family and growing affection for Cassidy. He glanced at her in the dim light of the limo's backseat, noticing a flicker of hurt in her eyes. He vowed then and there that he wouldn't let anyone, not even Estelle Pierce, sabotage this relationship, real or not. Days melted into weeks, and Alexander and Cassidy saw each other more frequently. Whether it was quick coffee dates or late-night strolls along the Hudson River, they spoke about everything and nothing. Their conversations ran deeper, sliding away from superficial chatter. He learned about her mother's final days, her struggle with medical bills, her regrets about never completing her degree. She learned about the pressure he felt from his father to uphold the family name and the gnawing emptiness he sometimes felt despite all his luxuries. At times, Alexander questioned himself. Was he truly ready to propose to her? Was this purely about a bet? The lines were blurring, but each time those doubts gnawed at him, he told himself he was simply seeing the bet through. That's all. One evening, they sat at a bench near her tiny apartment, sharing lukewarm pizza from a cardboard box. The fluorescent glow of a streetlight illuminated them in a halo-like circle. She was recounting a funny story of a rowdy customer who demanded an impossible latte creation, and Alexander found himself laughing wholeheartedly. Then, his phone buzzed James. He considered ignoring it, but he knew James wouldn't stop until he picked up. Stepping aside, he answered. "How goes it?" James asked, voice tinged with amusement. "Carter's checking in, you know." Wedding bells ringing yet. Alexander glanced at Cassidy. She waved him over, but he stayed put. "I'm working on it," he muttered. James chuckled. "Remember, you have less than 5 months left. The wedding has to happen, and you have to stay married for 1 year. No cheap outs." Alexander cut the call short and returned to Cassidy. She noticed the strain on his face. "Everything okay?" He forced a smile. "Yeah, just business stuff." They finished their pizza in pensive silence. When he drove her home that night, an idea sprouted in his mind, a daring, reckless, but necessary step if he wanted to fulfill the bet. The very next day, he orchestrated a plan. He texted Cassidy, inviting her to a special dinner. He hinted it was an anniversary of sorts, though they'd only known each other for a couple of months. She arrived at the designated address, a rooftop overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Twinkling fairy lights draped around a table set for two, complete with white linens and an array of fragrant roses. Soft music played in the background, a gentle melody that seemed to hover in the night air. She gasped, her eyes lighting up. "Alexander, what is this?" He stepped forward, heart pounding. If he were honest, this moment terrified him, not because of the bet, but because he realized how much he truly cared about her. "I thought I'd do something special. You said you never get to see the fancy side of New York. So here it is." She laughed, tears of happiness brimming. "It's beautiful." They dined under the stars, sharing jokes and stealing glances. Halfway through the meal, Alexander felt his palms grow sweaty. He reached under the table, brushed his fingers across the small velvet box in his pocket. His voice wavered when he finally spoke. "Cassidy, I've never met anyone like you. You've changed the way I see life, and I can't imagine going back to the way things were." He slowly knelt down, pulling out the ring box. Cassidy gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Will you marry me?" he asked, opening the box to reveal an elegant diamond ring. She stared at the ring, eyes wide with disbelief. Then she looked at him, her voice trembling. "Alexander, this is so sudden." He swallowed. "I know it is. And I don't want you to think I'm rushing you, but I've never been more certain of anything. You're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I want to build a life with you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. She gazed into his eyes, searching for sincerity. "I'm scared," she whispered. He gently took her hand. "I'll do everything in my power to keep you safe, to make you happy. I promise." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Finally, she exhaled, nodding. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, heart hammering so loudly he thought she could hear it. They stood, and he wrapped his arms around her, pressing a fervent kiss to her lips. The city lights shimmered in the background, and for a fleeting second, the bet was the last thing on his mind. Unbeknownst to them, in the shadows behind a decorative potted plant, a figure snapped photos with a phone. James. He grinned to himself. The wedding was on, and soon the real test would begin. News of the engagement exploded across Alexander's social circles. Gossip spread like wildfire, from private clubs to boardrooms. Some whispered that Alexander Pierce had finally found love. Others speculated that the girl must be after his money. A few cynically remarked that it must be a publicity stunt. Cassidy, though excited about the prospect of being with Alexander, found herself overwhelmed by the paparazzi that materialized outside her cafe. She had to speak with the manager, who kindly allowed her time off until things calmed down. It pained her to step away from her source of income, but the constant flash of cameras and barrage of questions made it impossible to work. Meanwhile, Alexander found his life a whirlwind of tuxedo fittings, flower selections, seating charts, and vendor appointments. Estelle insisted on orchestrating a grand affair befitting the Pierce family name. The wedding planner, a meticulous woman named Marianne Fletcher, presented lavish concepts featuring ice sculptures, imported roses, and a guest list that read like a who's who of high society. Cassidy's expression at these meetings ranged from hesitant to visibly uncomfortable. "This all seems like too much," she told Alexander one afternoon as they browsed through flower samples in a gilded showroom. "We don't need $1 million wedding. It's not who I am." He reached out, gently touching her elbow. "I know, but my mother is." He hesitated, noticing how her shoulders drooped. "I'm sorry. I'm just trying to keep the peace." She forced a smile. "It's okay. I'll get used to it." Yet her eyes betrayed lingering doubt. She never imagined her wedding day would be such a public spectacle. And the relentless scrutiny from tabloids digging into her past, prying into her family, was chipping away at her composure. One evening, as they sat in Alexander's penthouse, going through invitation cards, she pulled up a news article on her phone. The headline blared, "Waitress snags billionaire real love or gold digger scheme." Her hand shook. Alexander cursed under his breath, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "Don't read that trash. They'll write anything to stir up drama." She set the phone aside, tears gathering. "I don't want to be seen like this. I worked hard my whole life, and now they're saying I'm just mooching off you." He gently stroked her hair. "I know the truth, Cass. You're not using me, and I'm not a fool. People will say what they want." Despite his words, doubt began to creep in. She was genuinely upset, and deep down, he had the memory of that bet looming over him like a storm cloud. Would she ever forgive him if she found out the real reason he'd pursued her? He resolved to keep it hidden at least until after the wedding, maybe forever. By then, his hope was that their bond would be strong enough to withstand any revelation. As the wedding day drew closer, tension mounted. William Pierce barely hid his disdain for Cassidy, greeting her with cool civility. Estelle hovered, urging her to get fitted for an even more extravagant gown. Cassidy insisted on something simpler, but Estelle's pushy suggestions grew relentless. A week before the ceremony, Cassidy nearly broke. She confronted Alexander in his penthouse living room, frustration brimming. "I can't do this big circus of a wedding," she cried. "Everyone is trying to mold me into something I'm not." He pulled her close. "We can scale down." She placed a shaking hand on his chest. "Your mother won't let us. This is a Pierce wedding, remember?" His jaw tightened. "Then let me talk to her, I'll fix it." And he did try. He argued with Estelle, explaining Cassidy's discomfort. Eventually, they compromised on reducing the guest list somewhat and cutting out a few ostentatious elements. But it was still a grand event, a major social highlight. The tabloids labeled it the wedding of the year. Cassidy clung to Alexander's promise that once they were married, things would settle down. Little did either of them realize that the biggest shock was yet to come, and it would unfold on the very night they said "I do." The day arrived under a clear sky, the sun shining brightly over the opulent garden estate. Alexander's family had rented for the occasion. Rows of white chairs sprawled across the manicured lawn, and clusters of orchids and hydrangeas stood as tall as Cassidy's shoulders. A classical quartet played soft music, while uniformed staff ushered in guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits. Cassidy stood in a dressing suite with her maid of honor, her best friend from her old neighborhood, Elena Sanchez. Elena fussed with the train of Cassidy's gown, a simple yet elegant piece of satin that clung to her figure before flaring gently at the hem. "You look beautiful," Elena said, tears in her eyes. "I'm so proud of you." Cassidy exhaled a shaky breath. "I feel like I'm living in a dream, or someone else's life." Elena hugged her. "No matter how grand, remember you deserve happiness. Don't let anyone make you feel you don't." Outside, Alexander paced in a separate room, adrenaline and nerves coursing through him. He was flanked by James, who'd shown up in a crisp tux, looking oddly somber. "Nervous, man?" James asked, fiddling with a boutonniere. Alexander forced a laugh. "Yeah, more than I thought I'd be." James slanted him a look. "You're actually falling for her, aren't you?" Alexander hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I really am." James sighed. "This was supposed to be a bet, Alex." "Does she know? Are you going to tell her?" He paled. "Not tonight, not yet, maybe in time, but not tonight." James clapped him on the shoulder. "Good luck, buddy. You'll need it." The ceremony took place at twilight. Flickering lanterns and fairy lights lent a magical glow to the scene. As Cassidy walked down the aisle, all eyes locked on her. The hush was palpable, broken only by the gentle strumming of a harp. Alexander felt his heart stutter in his chest at the sight of her. In that moment, everything else melted away: his mother's disapproval, the tabloids, even the bet. All that remained was a profound sense of awe at this woman who'd entrusted her future to him. They exchanged vows beneath an arch of cascading flowers. Cassidy's voice trembled as she spoke, tears glistening. Alexander's words spilled out with surprising depth, every syllable carrying the weight of emotion he hadn't known he possessed. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause erupted. Cameras clicked, capturing their first kiss as a married couple. Confetti danced in the breeze. From across the crowd, Estelle tried to maintain a controlled smile, while William looked stoic. James raised a toast. Carter gave a playful wink. The reception was a lavish affair, replete with a champagne fountain and a massive 5-tier cake. A live band played upbeat tunes, and guests twirled across the dance floor. Cassidy found herself repeatedly congratulated by strangers who wore expressions of polite curiosity. She felt like a rare exhibit, both admired and scrutinized. Yet, whenever she locked eyes with Alexander, she felt a surge of warmth and certainty. Whatever chaos surrounded them, in that shared gaze she found a promise of security. As the night wound down, the newlyweds escaped into a private suite on the estate's second floor. The bed was adorned with rose petals, and a bottle of fine champagne chilled in a silver bucket. They stood for a moment, breathless from the festivities, the reality of their union settling over them. Alexander took her hands. "I meant every word out there," he whispered. She placed a hand on his cheek. "I did too." He kissed her deeply, the adrenaline of the day surging through both of them. The weight of the future pressed in, but for now, they had this night a celebration of a new life together. Unbeknownst to Alexander, Cassidy had a secret of her own, a secret so profound it would soon overshadow even his carefully guarded bet. And in the hush of that wedding night, she decided it was time to reveal it. The wedding suite was illuminated by the soft glow of bedside lamps. Outside the windows, moonlight washed over the estate gardens. Cassidy stood near the bed, the hem of her gown trailing over plush carpeting. Alexander carefully loosened his tie, still a bit dazed by the magnitude of the evening. Cassidy's fingers trembled as she slipped off her veil. She cleared her throat. "Alexander, there's something I need to tell you." He paused, his heart skipping a beat. "What's wrong?" She looked away, tears gathering. "Before my mother passed, she told me the truth about my father. I always believed he was just some guy who left us, but that's not it. He's wealthy, extremely wealthy." Alexander frowned. "Wealthy how? Like a business owner?" Cassidy inhaled. "He's none other than Charles Hamilton." "The Charles Hamilton?" Alexander's eyes widened in disbelief. Charles Hamilton was a legendary business tycoon, one whose empire sprawled across multiple industries: real estate, technology, entertainment. His net worth rivaled that of Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. His name was practically synonymous with power. "Cassidy," Alexander began, breath-catching. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "My mother met him when she was working as an assistant at one of his companies. They had an affair. When she got pregnant, he offered her hush money and she refused. She wanted him to be a father, but he never came around. The shame of it all was too much for her. She left and tried to raise me on her own. But before she died, she gave me a letter. He sent an apology, and it contained a trust fund in my name." Alexander took a step back, trying to process the bombshell. Cassidy's father was a billionaire mogul, more influential than most of the people in Alexander's own circle. He felt his mind reel. This changed everything, and ironically, it made her far richer than him. She bit her lip. "I never accessed that trust fund. I hated him. I still haven't forgiven him for abandoning us. But I've had this burden, this knowledge. I always worried that if someone discovered the truth, they'd see me differently. I didn't want that. Especially not you." Alexander's pulse pounded. Part of him wanted to laugh at the cosmic irony. The waitress he married on a bet was secretly the daughter of one of the richest men in the world. Another part of him felt betrayed that she'd withheld this. Then again, he had his own monumental deception lurking beneath their marriage. "Cassidy," he began, running a hand through his hair. "Why tell me now?" Tears glistened in her eyes. "Because I love you, and I don't want secrets between us. I know your life is complicated. I didn't want to add to that. But I can't go on living this lie, pretending to be someone I'm not." He pulled her into a tight embrace, emotions swirling: shock, empathy, love. "God, Cass," he murmured, "I'm not upset with you. I'm just stunned." She trembled in his arms. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hide anything, but I was terrified." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "It's okay. We'll figure it out. Together." In that moment, he felt closer to her than ever, bound by vulnerability and honesty. He wanted to tell her about the bet right then, to lay it all on the table. But fear held his tongue. This was her night, to unburden herself. He couldn't taint it with his own confession. Not yet. As they lay down together, the enormity of her revelation sank in. For all the times he thought she was the poor waitress in need of rescue, she was, in fact, the estranged daughter of a man whose power overshadowed even the Pierce name. Life was indeed a strange twist of fate. He decided he would come clean soon, tell her everything, because if she could share her darkest secret, then so could he. But destiny had other plans, and before he could muster the courage to speak, the revelations and confrontations heading their way would arrive with a force neither could have expected. Morning light poured through the curtains of the wedding suite. The estate was quiet, save for the chirping of birds. Cassidy and Alexander stirred from bed, their bodies still heavy from the emotional toll of the previous night. Despite the tension, a sense of serenity enveloped them together. They were married, bound by vows and truths revealed. They decided to forego a grand honeymoon, opting instead for a short trip to a secluded lodge in upstate New York. Cassidy yearned for privacy and simplicity, away from the scrutiny of cameras and the whispers of high society. A week later, they returned to the city, newly refreshed. But the moment they stepped off the private helicopter onto the Pierce family's helipad, reality slammed back. Estelle awaited them, arms crossed, her face tight. "Mother," Alexander greeted, nerves flaring. "Is everything all right?" Her gaze flicked to Cassidy. "We need to talk, both of you." They followed Estelle to a private sitting room, adorned with antiques and expensive art. William Pierce stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back, and James was there too, looking uncharacteristically uneasy. Estelle wasted no time. "We've heard quite the rumor." Something about you, Cassidy, and a trust fund. Care to elaborate? Cassidy's heart pounded. She glanced at Alexander, who nodded reassuringly. It's true. My father is Charles Hamilton. Estelle and William exchanged looks. William's face remained hard, unreadable. Estelle let out a brittle laugh. Charles Hamilton, one of the wealthiest men in the country. So, you're not the simple waitress we believed. A flicker of hurt flashed in Cassidy's eyes. I never wanted anyone to know. I haven't had contact with him in years. Estelle's brows furrowed. Do you realize what this means for the Pierce name? If you're recognized as Hamilton's heir, that sets you on a collision course with us. With him, with everything. William cleared his throat. We've already received calls from the press. They're swarming with questions. Charles Hamilton was contacted. He seems quite interested to meet his daughter. Cassidy stiffened. She hadn't expected her father to surface so soon. That old resentment flared in her chest. I'm not sure I want to meet him. William shrugged, his gaze cold. That's your prerogative, but the damage is done. The media is painting this as some epic union of two powerful families. You can't hide forever. Alexander stepped in, anger stirring. Why does it matter if she's Hamilton's daughter? We're married. She's my wife. Estelle's lips thinned. It matters because she lied, Alexander. She kept it from you, from all of us. Cassidy bristled. I didn't lie. I just never told you. And if we're talking about lies, Alexander, she paused, noticing the flicker of panic in his eyes. What is she talking about? Estelle demanded, looking at her son. Alexander swallowed hard. He had wanted to confess in private, not in front of his parents. But now Cassidy's gaze bore into him, expecting honesty. James stepped forward, face pale. Should I? Alexander shook his head. No, I'll do it. He turned to Cassidy, voice thick with remorse. Cass, I need to tell you something. The reason I approached you that day at the cafe, it wasn't just chance. I made a bet with Carter, with James, that I could marry a waitress and stay with her for a year. The words echoed in the silence. Cassidy's face went white as though slapped. She opened her mouth, but no sound emerged. Estelle gasped, scandalized. William's eyes narrowed, suspicion confirmed. James looked at the floor. Alexander pressed on, voice trembling. It started as a dare, a foolish, callous dare. But it changed once I got to know you. I swear I love you now, and that bet means nothing to me. A tremor racked Cassidy's body. So, from the start, I was just part of a game? Alexander reached for her, but she recoiled. Tears brimmed in her eyes. I told you everything, trusted you with my deepest secret, and you used me. He shook his head desperately. It wasn't like that anymore. I swear I fell in love with you. The bet was just the beginning. I had planned to tell you don't, she spat, voice thick with betrayal. Don't you dare say you were going to come clean. You let me stand at that altar, vow my life to you, without the slightest clue it all started as a sick wager. Her anger burned the air. Estelle and William stood by, strangely silent, while James looked on with obvious regret. Cassidy tore off her wedding ring, thrusting it into Alexander's hand. I can't even look at you right now. She turned and fled the room, choking back sobs. Alexander stood paralyzed, the ring cold in his palm. He felt the weight of his actions collapsing on him like a house of cards. In a single moment, the shimmering facade of their fairy tale wedding shattered. Now, the real test began. Would love, if it truly existed between them, be strong enough to overcome the betrayal that had brought them together in the first place? And there you have it, a story of hidden truths, shattered trust, and the complicated world of high-stakes marriage bets. Life can change in an instant, flipping our assumptions on their heads, whether it's discovering a long-lost billionaire father or learning your own husband pursued you under false pretenses. The question remains, can love truly triumph over secrets and lies? Or is the damage too great to repair? Only time and the resilience of the human heart will tell. If you found yourself swept up in this tale of passion, betrayal, and ultimate redemption, then don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps me continue bringing you dramatic and captivating stories. Join our community today and stay tuned for more twists and turns to keep you on the edge of your seat.